Welcome to episode 14 of Critical Thinking in COVID-19. We'll be looking at critical thinking and the lockdown protests. While most Americans do support the lockdown, at least at this time, this could change, of course, a tiny fraction of the population has engaged in often armed protest. While the topic of protest is primarily a matter for political philosophy and ethics, critical thinking, of course, applies here as well. While the protests have been minuscule in size relative to the whole population of the country, they've attracted considerable media attention. They make the national news regularly when they occur, and the story is repeated and amplified. On the one hand, this does make sense. Armed protests against the effort to protect Americans from the virus are certainly news. On the other hand, media coverage is disproportional to the size and importance of the protest. The non-right-leaning media, sometimes referred to as the left media or the lamestream media, is often attacked for having a liberal bias. And while this claim can be debated endlessly about the bias of the media, it is evident that the media does have a general bias in favor of stories that do attract attention. Both public and private news services need to offer stories that attract attention and draw an audience. They need this audience to stay in operation, be in the form of money from sponsors, money from advertising, or money from donors, depending on the source of the money. Protests, especially ones that are armed, certainly do pull in an audience. It can also be argued that some news services have a clear political agenda, and this agenda is served by covering such stories. But again, this can be a matter of debate. People, of course, because of various biases, see the news they agree with as perfectly objective. The news that goes against what they believe must clearly be flawed or even fake news. Now, while it can be argued that such stories are worth covering in the news, disproportional coverage can lead people to commit what could be called the spotlight fallacy. This fallacy is committed when a person uncritically assumes that the degree of media coverage given to something is proportional to how often it occurs or how important it is. It's also they're also committed when someone uncritically assumes the media coverage of a group is representative of the size or importance of that group. So the first form looks like this. Spotlight fallacy, form 1, boring you with variables. So premise 1, and again, building arguments in philosophy, you've got evidence that's being offered, the premises, and the conclusion is what's being supported, hopefully, by the evidence. Now, in the case of a fallacy, philosophically speaking, is bad logic. The premise or premises do not logically support the conclusion. Now, a fallacy doesn't mean the claims are false. That's actually a fallacy to think that a fallacy must have a false conclusion. The problem is with the logic, but everything in there could be true. To use an analogy, think of someone just doing, bad math. They're trying to, balance their checkbook and they're terrible at math and they screw everything up. They could, by pure chance, end up getting the right answer. And so a fallacy is bad logic. So what is the bad logic here? Well, premise 1, X, receives extensive coverage in the media. Conclusion, X occurs in a frequency or is important proportional to its coverage. So the mistake being made is someone just infers uncritically that because something is covered quite a bit in the media, that it's got to be occurring quite a bit, or is as important as its coverage. Now, it might be occurring that much. It may be that important, but it's simply a leap from media's talking about it a lot, it must be important, it must be happening a lot, would be a mistake in logic. So the second version, form 2, occurs in this way. Premise 1, people of type P, or group G, receive extensive coverage in the media. Conclusion, the coverage of people of type P, or people of group G, is proportional to how P and G represent the general population. Now, taking away the variables and stuff being more informal, That is this. People of a certain type or members of a certain group receive a lot of coverage in the media. Therefore, because of this coverage, those people or that group represent the general population to the degree they're covered in the media. So someone might say, gosh, they're covering a lot of people like this, or a lot of people of this group. There must be a lot of people like that are doing those things. Now again, this could all be true. It may be that there's a lot of coverage of people in the media because there's a lot of people that are doing that or like that. But it doesn't follow just because there's a lot of coverage that there are a lot of people of that type or a lot of members of that group that represent the population as a whole. So why is this bad logic bad? Well, this line of reasoning, both forms, spotlight fallacy 1, spotlight fallacy 2, they are fallacious because the fact that someone or something attracts the most attention or coverage in the media, or social media, does not mean that it represents the whole population, and it also doesn't mean that it is therefore frequent or important. This spotlight fallacy obviously derives its name from the fact that receiving a great deal of attention or coverage is often referred to as being in the spotlight. It is similar to other fallacies like hasty generalization, which is drawing a conclusion from a sample that's too small, biased sample, drawing a conclusion from a sample that is biased in some important way, and misleading vividness, a classic fallacy in which someone believes that something is, typically that it's going to occur quite often because it's such a vivid thing, gets so much attention. Now, the error being made in the spotlight fallacy involves generalizing about a whole population based on a sample that's somehow inadequate or flawed, either too small or biased in some manner. And typically the bias will be that it's something exciting that gets attention, and that would be a biased sample. Now, getting back to the lockdown protest, the protests so far are extremely limited in both occurrence and size. That is, they don't happen that often, and they're relatively small compared to the millions and millions of people in the United States. But the extent of media coverage conveys the opposite message. So how do you defend against being pulled in by the spotlight fallacy? How do you resist the media? Well, the defense is, this is going to be kind of boring. It's to look at the relevant statistics. As noted above, while the lockdown protest gets a great deal of coverage, they're tiny events relative to the whole population and all that is occurring. And so this is not to say they have no importance whatsoever, because obviously it's worth knowing that a few people are engaged in protest, and they're often armed protest. As such, we should look at the protest not through the magnifying glass of the media that can blow things way out of proportion to attract attention, but through the corrective lens of good reasoning. I now turn to looking at an ad hominem attack on the protesters. Again, my whole point in critical thinking is not to attack people or destroy people. The point of critical thinking is to get to the truth as much as possible. And that requires applying the principle of charity and being fair and perhaps even balanced. For real. So, some critics of the protesters have pointed to the well-established fact that while there are some grassroots aspects to the protesters are also being manipulated by a concerted astroturfing campaign. Astroturfing, if you're not familiar with it, I'm not talking about the fake grass that people play sports on and debate about. Astroturfing is a technique in which the true sponsors of a message or organization create the appearance, the illusion, that the message organization is the results of grassroots activism. In other words, what they do is they try to make it appear like people are spontaneously organizing and working together at a community level and not being given organization and a push and funding by outside groups. Now, this can happen, of course, regardless of political political spectrum. And so it's not that this is just a tool of the right or a tool of the wicked left. It's something that, groups engage in who have money and influence. So looking at the lockdown protest, who is astroturfing them? Well, support and organization seems to be provided by individuals and groups that support Trump's re-election, and also those who are very concerned about the economy reopening, returning to making money. And this has been something that's been expressed quite openly. In fact, there are people who say openly and publicly in front of cameras that they're willing to allow some people to die to reopen the economy. And that part is no secret conspiracy. Again, you can check for yourself and see the videos of public officials and others openly saying essentially that they're willing to let people die, in some cases even themselves. So points for consistency to get the economy going again. Now, while such astroturfing is a matter of concern, because if a movement is supposed to be grassroots and expressing the will of the people, you'd want to know, is it really doing so? Or are people being, kind of pushed, motivated, etc., to present this? Now, on the right, they often talk about crisis actors, the claim being that people are paid to lie to the press or lie to people. And so there certainly is a legitimate concern that allegedly grassroots movements are being astroturfed. But as always, you would need evidence to support that. And being just merely suspicious or thinking, surely, these people can't really mean this must all be lies, would not be good enough. Now, while such astroturfing is a matter of concern, to reject the claims of protesters, even if they are protesting on astroturf rather than standing on a true grassroots, foundation, would be to commit one or possibly two fallacies. So this is aimed at people who are attacking the protesters with bad logic. Again, critical thinking is about the truth, not about scoring political points or destroying people. It's not about that stuff. So our first fallacy is the ad hominem. Translation from the Latin is to the man. And this is, put generically, there's actually multiple types of ad hominems, but to keep things kind of simple, I'll just use a general ad hominem. This occurs when a person's claim is rejected because of some alleged irrelevant defect about the person. And it's got this form. Again, it's a bad argument, so it's got premises and a conclusion, and it's bad logic. So premise 1, person A makes claim C. Premise 2, an irrelevant attack is made on person A. Conclusion, C is false. Put hopefully less boringly and more informally, that is this. Person makes a claim, then I attack the person, not physically, I just make some attack against something about them, and then I say, aha, their claim is false. And that would be an ad hominem, because simply attacking someone doesn't prove their claim is false. Now, in terms of credibility, if you refer back to an earlier video in the series, you can legitimately question people's credibility, which can give you reason to have suspicions about their claim. But no attack on a person shows their claim is false. That's not how it works. Now, what if the attack is against the protesters as a group? Rejecting their claim, saying, aha, those protesters they're astroturfing. They've got the big secret money behind them, the shadow state. I guess on the right it's the deep state. I guess the left needs one too. I guess we could call it the shadow state, maybe. But anyways, or the dark conspiracy, which is actually a role-playing game. I used to write for that. So what is this genetic fallacy? Well, if the group is being attacked as opposed to individual protesters, it'd be a genetic fallacy. And this is bad logic, in which a perceived defect in the origin of a claim or thing is seen as evidence that discredits the claim or thing. So whereas the ad hominem is literally against or to the person, the genetic fallacy can apply to groups. I mean, there's other applications as well, but it's kind of the group fallacy. And it looks like this, at least in the group form. Premise 1, Group A makes claim C. Premise 2, Group A has some alleged defect. Conclusion, C is false. Put it informally, it worked like this. This group makes a claim. Aha, that group has some irrelevant defect. Therefore, the claim is false. And again, attacking your group doesn't prove their claim is false. Just like with individuals, of course, there are legitimate grounds to question credibility. But no matter how lacking in credibility a group is, it doesn't follow that their claim is therefore false. You can have good reasons to be suspicious. So if you have a news outlet that's dedicated, say, to saying whatever is needed to be said, no matter whether it's a lie or not, to support a particular politician or side they want, then you have good grounds to be suspicious of them and not accept their claims just because they say it. But it doesn't mean their claims are therefore false. That'd be genetic fallacy. Now, while it is important to avoid committing fallacies against the protesters, to reject them because one does not like that they're, putting people at risk, or one says, oh, look at those people, with their guns and their Call of Duty LARPing, they're just wrong. Well, those would be ad hominems. Or saying, oh, look at that group of people, they're all just, fools of the astroturfers, servants of their corporate masters. Genetic fallacy. So it doesn't refute their claims. Now, it's also important to extend the same to people who are critical of the protesters. So the ad hominem, the genetic fallacy, can be committed against those who are critical of the protesters. So, for example, if someone says this protesting is a bad idea because they're putting themselves and others at risk by not wearing masks and getting up shouting at people, if someone says back to the critic they hate Trump and they hate freedom, so they're wrong, that'd just be an ad hominem. I mean, it may be true that they hate Trump. Maybe they even do hate freedom. But it doesn't mean that their claim is false. So, takeaway here is ad hominems and genetic fallacies, bad logic. So simply attacking the protesters as a group or individually, or attacking the critics as a group or individually, proves absolutely nothing. Again, psychological, super effective. Makes me sad every day I think about it. But bad logic and no logic at all are far more persuasive than good logic. But that's just the way things work, sadly. Now, one obvious reason for the protest, and we can look at why are people protesting, is a very sensible one. The lockdown does come with an extremely high price. People have lost their jobs, and thus lose their insurance. And the way the United States works, most of us get our insurance through our jobs. That's how I get mine. And if I lost my job, well, there goes my insurance. I mean, true, you can really struggle hard to try to get it another way, but if you're not working, getting the money to pay for it, kind of hard. And being out of work is bad. Not being able to go out and do things is, annoying. Not being able to, because people were complaining they can't get their hair cut. Oh, cut my own. Should be obvious that this is a do-it-yourself haircut. And I totally understand that. Being confined essentially to one's house, having to avoid people is, unpleasant. And if you've lost your job, then it's actively awful. I mean, it's a burden and suffering. So it's natural to express protests against this situation that wherever people are losing their jobs, people are suffering, and it makes sense that people would be angry at how things have played out and what's being done or not done. But there's more to it than just people are, they are rightfully thinking that there's a high price being paid, and they feel, that they need to express themselves. So the people that protest are doing more than just expressing their concerns and worries about the lockdown. They seem to be making political statements. And these statements are often thoroughly entangled with many other political statements. If you look at videos of the protest, you'll see people there, supporting Trump. The anti-vaxxers have jumped into this as well, attaching themselves to the protest. Anti-abortion people apparently are involved as well. And with all the guns, being displayed prominently at many protests, Second Amendment rights there as well. And if you look at the sort of the edges of the protest, you'll see sometimes Confederate flags, Nazi symbols, and so white nationalism is on the street as well. Now, it is very, very, very important to note, this is not to claim that every protester endorses all the views expressed in the protest. Attending a protest about one thing does not entail that a person supports whatever is said by the protesters, around them. Because if you go to protest the lockdown, and someone shows up with like a Nazi sign, you might look over and go, God, what is this Nazi doing here? I'm just against the lockdown. Why is this Nazi so close to me? Or you may be totally in favor of vaccines and be protesting because you hate the lockdown, but you really want a vaccine. You look over and you see someone being anti-vax. You're like, God, I'm really hoping for vaccines. Give me that vaccine. I want to get back to work and socializing and get on with my life. And so it's important whenever you see like a protest of any sort, be it on the right or the left or whatever, to not like look around in the crowd to single out signs or people that you might really hate and then attribute to the whole group the beliefs of that individual you don't like. So in the case of the protest, if someone says, look at that guy with the swastika standing over there. All these protesters, they got to be Nazis. Doesn't fall. Now, if everybody's holding like a Nazi sign, yeah, the Nazis are Nazis. But if there's somebody on the fringe or the edge, and it's caught on camera, you need not define the whole group. Now, to believe that the individuals in the group, around the edges, etc., define the group, that would be to fall into guilt by association. The idea being that the whole group is defined by people who just happen to be there. And it's a common tactic. So, for example, people on the right, if there's a protest on the left and some anarchists show up and, set some things on fire, it's normal to say, oh, geez, all these liberal protesters just want to burn stuff. Likewise, people on the left, they look at a protest about the lockdown, see like somebody with a Nazi, symbol, and they say, oh, all those protesters, they're just Nazis. And they're both making the same mistake, guilt by association. Now, again, if all the liberals are burning stuff, then yeah, the liberals are burning stuff. And if all the people at the protest are, wearing Nazi stuff, yeah, they're Naziing. Now, there's also the fact that many groups and individuals are trying to exploit the protest for their own purpose. They're there. Maybe they don't believe in the actual protest itself, but they like cameras, and that's where the cameras are going to be. And again, these are things to take into account. So kind of the takeaway is, in the case of the protest, you can't automatically define them by whoever just shows up on camera, and keep in mind that there are groups, anti-vaxxers, Nazis, etc., that are drawn to cameras. They want to show up and make it look like that's theirs, that all the people there are like Nazis or anti-vaxxers. So always be careful when interpreting what the media shows, because just because someone's there doesn't mean that defines the entire group. That said, the protests are an expression of a very polarized political view, and it strikes many people as very odd that other people would be protesting basic pandemic, precautions. Now, one driving force behind this is what I've been calling in recent times the two sides problem. While there are many manifestations of the problem, the idea is this. When there are two polarized sides, and I mean there could be more, but we'll just go with the two sides because we got the left and the right in the US, and all the people caught in the middle. The idea is that when there are two polarized sides, this provides fuel and accelerant to rhetoric and fallacies, thus making these fallacies and rhetoric more likely to occur. Another aspect of having two sides is that it's much easier to exploit and manipulate people by appealing to their membership in one group and their opposition to another. You have ready-made, devils, the other side, and ready-made angels, your side. In the case of the protest, there has been a weaponization of public health. Trump's re-election obviously depends heavily on public perception of his handling of the pandemic. and most heavily, as has been pointed out by the experts, on the economy. So good economy, he probably gets reelected. Just a historical, probability. So if people take the pandemic too seriously and are very critical of the way Trump handled it, that does not help his chance of being reelected. Now, Trump does have a trump card here, namely the economy. If the economy is, going good come November, then Trump will probably get a second term. But this hinges on the economy being strong in time for the election. So, not reopening the economy hurts Trump. So there's a motivation, and there's two sides. The people who want Trump, support him, they need to reopen the economy. So they're going to push for that. Those who push safety would be seen as being opposed to Trump. Also, those who recommend the lockdown are medical experts. That's where we get the idea and push from. And of course, I've talked about the anti-expert bias in the United States, and so that's a problem as well. Now, the weaponization of this health crisis follows the usual tactics. Disinformation about the crisis, claims of hoaxes, scapegoating. For example, President Trump recently started blaming Obama, coming up with this Obamagate just came out of nowhere. The idea is to blame, Obama for, I guess, what's going on or distract people. There's also anti-expert rhetoric, conspiracy theories, and such. Part of what drives this is the in-group bias. It's a cognitive bias that inclines people to assign positive qualities to their group, they are the angels, and assign negative qualities to other groups, they are the devils, or demons, depending on what you prefer. This also, of course, applies to accepting or rejecting claims. So claims made by my side, good. Claims made by the other side, bad. Just because of where it comes from. Which, of course, is crap logic. Now, this weaponization is not new or unique to the pandemic. American politics has been marked by politicizing and weaponizing a vast range of things, so that one side can claim a short-term, small advantage at the cost of doing very large, long-term harm. Now, this takes us off, of course, into politics, but critical thinking requires us to make good decisions, to be aware of this, and to be honest about the cost of allowing this to be a standard tool of politics. Now, while there are many aspects to the lockdown protest, one of the core justifications is that a lockdown is a violation of constitutional rights. The constitutional aspect, of course, is a matter of law, constitutional law. And I'll leave that to the experts in law to debate, because I'm not an expert in law. There's also the ethical aspect, whether the lockdown is morally acceptable or not. And this issue can be cast in terms of moral rights. This discussion would take us far afield into the realm of moral philosophy, but I'll close with an analogy that just might be worth considering. That's Vladimir Putin, by the way. That not me, although we both belong to the club of the League of Extraordinary Shirtless Gentlemen with short haircuts. Both members of that particular group. Meetings, well, not anymore because of COVID, but back again, probably Montana with nachos. So while the protesters are against the lockdown broadly, opposition to wearing masks is an aspect of the protest. While there is rational debate about the efficacy of these masks, the moral argument is that the state does not have the right to compel people to wear masks. It can also be presented in terms of people having rights the state must respect. One possibility is that people have the right to decide what parts of the body they wish to cover. If so, the obvious analogical argument is that if this right entitles people to go without mask, it also entitles people to go without clothes. So if imposing masks is oppression, then so is imposing clothing in general. If there is the right to bear arms, there's also the right to bear arms, and other parts as well. Another possible right is the right to endanger others, or at least freely expose other people to, shall we say, physical bodily ejections that other people don't want to encounter. If there is such a right, it could be argued that people have a right to fire guns as they wish, to drive as they wish, even if doing so is likely to harm or kill others. If there is a right to expose other people to, we'll call them physical bodily ejections, they don't want to be exposed to, then this would entail that people have the right to spit and urinate on other people. This all seems absurd. As a practical matter, of course, people are incredibly inconsistent when it comes to rights and restrictions. So I would certainly expect most people to simply dismiss these analogies, not based on any assessment of them based on similarities and relevance, but reject them simply because they don't want to wear masks, but probably don't want people running around naked, peeing on their legs, which I understand. I don't want people peeing on my leg either. But if masks are oppression and being forced to wear them violates people's rights, then the same would apply to clothes. They would be oppression, and the state compelling us to wear clothing would be a violation of our rights. So if we have a right to go without masks, we also have a right to nakedness. And I really hope the protesters embrace this, and I would expect to see in the news soon heavily armed people who are otherwise naked, protesting their right to bear whatever parts of their body they wish. As always, stay safe, and I will see you in the future.